Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, January 4th, 2013. So I have been told. The music was not intended. I was just playing something because I was having headset difficulties, just to make sure that the sound was indeed on, you all could hear it and all of that. I'm so disgusted. My headset went out and I had it like a month. I am once again in need of a headset. I'm disgusted. That too is to blame on white people. They are very good about manufacturing malarkey that does not work as it should. If any listeners out there would like to support, invest in the C.O.W.S headset, Amazon.com, my wish list, Gus T Renegade, should be at the top of the list. Headset. I'm so disgusted. I just got a brand new headset and it stopped working, and I checked because I had an old pair, and I checked and they're still working fine. Anyway, the plantation. Invest, listener supported. Invest if you think the program is constructive. You can visit my blog, racism-notes.blogspot.com. PayPal button is in the top corner, listener supported. Also, if you visit the blog, you'll see my new post, the LA Lakers, racism, white supremacy. I was able to discuss a white man named White Chocolate and a dark complexion, highly melanated black male, Michael Jordan, being referenced as vanilla, having a reputation for being vanilla. All in the same. Should be available, racism-notes.blogspot.com. All right, we will get to the study session, George Orwell, 1984. This week 5, I believe, that we've been doing Mr. Orwell's very interesting work. Hopefully people are taking notes, observing trends in the book as we roll. Looking forward to hearing feedback. If anyone recalled, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the term niggling was used in the text. If you wrote anything, paragraph, blog post, let us know. We had several folks who did write a little something down to share about the use of that term in the book and its broader implications. I just heard a podcast where some white people talked about the word niggardly and if that was racist to use that term. Man, we'll share more about that on the compensatory call-in tomorrow. 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Compensatory call-in. We can chat more about that then. Getting to Orwell. Really looking forward to this week. I was excited. I thought it was a good stopping point last week, right when Winston was getting the copy of the book that's supposed to have all this great information about the system of injustice that's operating in Oceania worldwide. He's just about to get the book, just about to start reading it, and that's where we will pick up this week. That'll be like the first thing, Winston reading from the book. I contemplated beginning this week with an audio clip. Filmmaker Oliver Stone, he did, I think he did Natural Born Killers. He did JFK. He did a film, so-called docudrama, where white people are not giving you accurate information about things. They're just presenting an idea, a way that they want you to think about an event. He did a film on 9/11 as well. His was the film on the plane that is reported to have crashed. Where was it? In Pennsylvania, I believe. He did a film on that in like 2006, 2007. But at any rate, Oliver Stone is doing this interview where he talks about we're in an Orwellian state, and President Obama represents Big Brother. President Obama is doing all these oppressive things and spying on everyone and passing legislation, passing all these laws so that they can spy on everyone, just like Big Brother in Orwell. They mentioned Fahrenheit 451 as well. I was going to do it, but the interview is about 15 minutes, and it's pretty interesting for the whole 15, just some of the words that they use. He even accuses President Obama of codifying the current system and practice of injustice. It was fascinating on a lot of levels. And this is just like 3 days ago, and I think that's the title of it. Oliver Stone says we're in Orwellian society. I put it on my Facebook page, facebook.com/the problem is white people. We'll go ahead and get started. I will share a little bit briefly before we get started on the article that I was reading last week, George Orwell Notes on Nationalism, just because I thought it was pretty interesting. He has quite a few essays that I think reveal some truth. Again, this is a pretty long essay. Not going to read the whole thing. A listener even shared a different essay that they thought worthy of sharing on the program. I just think this one has some interesting tidbits. Even further down I'm going to get to today. So I'll read a little bit, and then once I conclude, we'll start with audio segment number 1. So this is from his essay, Notes on Nationalism. A little further down, I think last week I read about the beginning third, maybe beginning fifth of the essay. I'm skipping down a little ways. Obviously, there are considerable resemblances between political Catholicism as exemplified by Chesterton and communism. So there are between either of these and, for instance, Scottish nationalism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, or Trotskyism. It would be an oversimplification to say that all forms of nationalism are the same, even in their mental atmosphere, but there are certain rules that hold good in all cases. The following are the principal characteristics of nationalistic thought. Keep in mind, nationalism, I'm saying white supremacy. Just keep that in mind. So these are characteristics. Obsession. As nearly as possible, no nationalist ever thinks, talks, or writes about anything except the superiority of his own power unit. It is difficult, if not impossible, for any nationalist to conceal his allegiance. The smallest slur upon his own unit or any implied praise of a rival organization fills him with uneasiness, which he can relieve only by making some sharp retort. If the chosen unit is an actual country such as Ireland or India, he will generally claim superiority for it not only in military power and political virtue, but in art, literature, sport, structure of the language, and the physical beauty of the inhabitants, and perhaps even the climate, scenery, and cooking. He will show great sensitiveness about such things as the correct display of flags, relative size of headlines, and the order in which different countries are named. That is Dr. Welsing moment. Flags. Nomenclature plays a very important part in nationalist thought. Countries which have won their independence or gone through a nationalist revolution usually change their names, and any country or other unit round which strong feelings revolve is likely to have several names, each of them carrying a different implication. The two sides of the Spanish Civil War had between them 9 or 10 names expressing different degrees of love and hatred. Some of these names, for example, patriots for Franco supporters or loyalists for government supporters, were frankly question-begging, and there was no single one of the which the two rival factions could have agreed to use. All nationalists consider it a duty to spread their own language to the detriment of rival languages, and among English speakers this struggle reappears in subtler forms as a struggle between dialects. Anglophobe Americans will refuse to use a slang phrase if they know it to be of British origin, and the conflict between Latinizers and Germanizers often has nationalist motives behind it. Scottish nationalists insist on the superiority of lowland Scots, and socialists whose nationalism takes the form of class hatred tirade against the BBC accent, and even the often gives the impression of being tinged by belief in sympathetic magic, a belief which probably comes out in the widespread custom of burning political enemies in effigy or using pictures of them as targets in shooting galleries. Instability, another characteristic. The intensity with which they are held does not prevent nationalist loyalties from being transferable. To begin with, as I have pointed out already, they can be and often are fastened up on some foreign country. One quite commonly finds that great nationalist leaders or the founders of nationalist movements do not even belong to the country they have glorified. Sometimes they are outright foreigners, or more often they have come from peripheral areas where nationality is doubtful. Examples are Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, de Valera, Disraeli, Poincare, Beaverbrook. The Pan-German movement was in part the creation of an Englishman, Houston Chamberlain. For the past 50 or 100 years, transferred nationalism has been a common phenomenon among literary intellectuals. With Lafcadio Hearn, the transference was to Japan, with Carlyle and many others of his time to Germany, and in our own age it is usually to Russia. But the peculiarly interesting fact is that retransference is also possible. A country or other unit which has been worshipped for years may suddenly become detestable, and some other object of affection may take its place with almost no interval. In the first version of H.G. Wells' Outline of History, and others of his writings about that time, one finds the United States praised almost as extravagantly as Russia is praised by communists today. Yet within a few years, this uncritical admiration had turned into hostility. The bigoted communist who changes in a space of weeks or even days into an equally bigoted Trotskyite is a common spectacle. In continental Europe, fascist movements were largely recruited from among communists, and the opposite process may well happen within the next few years. What remains constant in the nationalist is his state of mind. The object of his feelings is changeable and may be imaginary. But for an intellectual, transference has an important function which I have already mentioned shortly in connection with Chesterton. It makes it possible for him to be much more nationalistic, more vulgar, more silly, more malignant, more dishonest that he could ever be on behalf of his native country or any unit of which he had real knowledge. When one sees the slavish or boastful rubbish that is written about Stalin, the Red Army, etc., by fairly intelligent and sensitive people, one realizes that this is only possible because some kind of dislocation has taken place. In societies such as ours, it is unusual for anyone describable as an intellectual to feel a very deep attachment to his own country. Public opinion, that is, the section of public opinion of which he as an intellectual is aware, will not allow him to do so. Most of the people surrounding him are skeptical and disaffected, and he may not adopt the same attitude from imitativeness or sheer cowardice. In that case, he will have abandoned the form of nationalism that lies nearest to hand without getting any closer to a genuinely internationalist outlook. He still feels the need for a fatherland, and it is natural to look for one somewhere abroad. Having found it, he can wallow unrestrainedly in exactly those emotions from which he believes that he has emancipated himself. God, the king, the empire, the Union Jack, all the overthrown idols can reappear under different names, and because they are not recognized for what they are, they can be worshipped with a good conscience. Transferred nationalism, like the use of scapegoats, is a way of attaining salvation without altering one's conduct. I'll read a tad more, then we'll get to the audio. Just continuing. Indifference to reality, one of his next characteristics of nationalism, maybe even white supremacy. All nationalists have the power of not seeing resemblances between similar sets of facts. A British Tory will defend self-determination in Europe and oppose it in India with no feeling of inconsistency. Actions are held to be good or bad, not of their own merits. Sorry, I was making my screen larger so it would be easier to read. Lost my place. Okay. Actions are held to be good or bad, not in their own merits, but according to who does them, and there is almost no kind of outrage. Torture, the use of hostages, forced labor, mass deportations, imprisonment committed by imprisonment without trial, forgery, assassination, the bombing of civilians, which does not change its moral color when it is committed by our side. The Liberal News Chronicle published, as an example of shocking barbarity, photographs of Russians hanged by Germans, and then a year or two later published with warm approval almost exactly similar photographs of Germans hanged by Russians. It is the same with historical events. History is thought of largely in nationalist terms, and such things as the Inquisition, the tortures of the Star Chamber, the exploits of the English buccaneers, Sir Francis Drake, for instance, who was given to sinking Spanish prisoners alive, the Reign of Terror, the heroes of the mutiny blowing hundreds of Indians from the guns, or Cromwell's soldiers slashing Irish women's faces with razors, become morally neutral or even meritorious when it is felt that they were done in the right cause. If one looks back over the past quarter of a century, one finds that there was hardly a single year when atrocity stories were not being reported from some part of the world, and yet in not one single case were these atrocities in Spain, Russia, China, Hungary, Mexico, Smyrna, believed in and disapproved of by the English intelligentsia as a whole. Whether such deeds were reprehensible or even whether they had happened was always decided according to political predilection. The nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. For quite 6 years, the English admirers of Hitler contrived not to learn of the existence of Dachau and Buchenwald. And those who are loudest in denouncing the German concentration camps are often quite unaware or only very dimly aware that there are also concentration camps in Russia. Huge events like the Ukraine famine of 1933 involving the death of millions of people have actually escaped the attention of the majority of English Russophiles. Many English people have heard almost nothing about the extermination of German and Polish Jews during the present war. Their own anti-Semitism has caused this vast crime to bounce off their consciousness. In nationalist thought, there are facts which are both true and untrue, known and unknown. A known fact may be so unbearable that it is habitually pushed aside and not allowed to enter into logical processes, or, on the other hand, it may enter into every calculation and yet never be admitted as a fact, even in one's own mind. I will stop there. Moving forward, George Orwell, 1984. This is the 5th study section. We are approximately, I think they will say the chapter when we get started, so I'll hush and let them give out the chapter. I know we are beyond chapter 8. We are a little bit more than halfway through the book. If you are following along, hard copy, pay attention. Looking forward to hearing input once we get done with the first section. 1984, Mr. George Orwell.
1984, Cassette 5.
Oceania was at war with Eastasia. Oceania had always been at war with Eastasia. A large part of the political literature of 5 years was now completely obsolete. Reports and records of all kinds, newspapers, books, pamphlets, films, soundtracks, photographs, all had to be rectified at lightning speed. Although no directive was ever issued, it was known that the chiefs of the department intended that within 1 week no reference to the war with Eurasia or the alliance with Eastasia should remain in existence anywhere. The work was overwhelming, all the more so because the processes that it involved could not be called by their true names. Everyone in the records department worked 18 hours in the 24, with 2 3-hour snatches of sleep. Mattresses were brought up from the cellars and pitched all over the corridors. Meals consisted of sandwiches and Victory coffee wheeled round on trolleys by attendants from the canteen. Each time that Winston broke off for one of his spells of sleep, he tried to leave his desk clear of work. And each time that he crawled back, sticky-eyed and aching, it was to find that another shower of paper cylinders had covered the desk like a snowdrift, half burying the speakwrite and overflowing onto the floor, so that the first job was always to stack them into a neat enough pile to give him room to work. What was worst of all was that the work was by no means purely mechanical. Often it was enough merely to substitute one name for another, but any detailed report of events demanded care and imagination. Even the geographical knowledge that one needed in transferring the war from one part of the world to another was considerable. By the 3rd day his eyes ached unbearably, and his spectacles needed wiping every few minutes. It was like struggling with some crushing physical task, something which one had the right to refuse and which one was nevertheless neurotically anxious to accomplish. Insofar as he had time to remember it, he was not troubled by the fact that every word he murmured into the speakwrite, every stroke of his ink pencil, was a deliberate lie. He was as anxious as anyone else in the department that the forgery should be perfect. On the morning of the 6th day, the dribble of cylinders slowed down. For as much as half an hour, nothing came out of the tube, then one more cylinder, then nothing. Everywhere, at about the same time, the work was easing off. A deep, and as it were secret, sigh went through the department. A mighty deed, which could never be mentioned, had been achieved. It was now impossible for any human being to prove by documentary evidence that the war with Eurasia had ever happened. At 1200 it was unexpectedly announced that all workers in the ministry were free till tomorrow morning. Winston, still carrying the briefcase containing the book, which had remained between his feet while he worked and under his body while he slept, went home, shaved himself, and almost fell asleep in his bath, although the water was barely more than tepid. With a sort of voluptuous creaking in his joints, he climbed the stair above Mr. Charrington's shop. He was tired, but not sleepy any longer. He opened the window, lit the dirty little oil stove, and put on a pan of water for coffee. Julia would arrive presently. Meanwhile there was the book. He sat down in the sluttish armchair and undid the straps of the briefcase. a heavy black volume, amateurishly bound with no name or title on the cover. The print also looked slightly irregular. The pages were worn at the edges and fell apart easily, as though the book had passed through many hands. The inscription on the title page ran, "The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism," by Emmanuel Goldstein. Winston began reading. Chapter 1. Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their attitude toward one another, have varied from age to age. But the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. Winston stopped reading, chiefly in order to appreciate the fact that he was reading, in comfort and safety. He was alone. No telescreen, no ear at the keyhole, no nervous impulse to glance over his shoulder or cover the page with his hand. The sweet summer air played against his cheek. From somewhere far away there floated the faint shouts of children. In the room itself there was no sound except the insect voice of the clock. He settled deeper into the armchair and put his feet up on the fender. It was bliss. It was eternity. Suddenly, as one sometimes does with a book of which one knows that one will ultimately read and reread every word, he opened it at a different place and found himself at the third chapter. He went on reading. Chapter 3. War is Peace. The splitting up of the world into three great superstates was an event which could be, and indeed was, foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. With the absorption of Europe by Russia and the British Empire by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were already effectively in being. The third, East Asia, only emerged as a distinct unit after another decade of confused fighting. The frontiers between the three superstates are in some places arbitrary, and in others they fluctuate according to the fortunes of war, but in general they follow geographical lines. Eurasia comprises the whole of the northern part of the European and Asiatic landmass from Portugal to the Bering Strait. Oceania comprises the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, including the British Isles, Australasia, and the southern portion of Africa. East Asia, smaller than the others and with a less definite western frontier, comprises China and the countries to the south of it, the Japanese islands, and a large but fluctuating portion of Mongolia and Tibet. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitude toward it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as raping, looting, the slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners, which extend even to boiling and burying alive, are looked upon as normal, and, when they are committed by one's own side and not by the enemy, meritorious. But in a physical sense, war involves very small numbers of people, mostly highly trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on the vague frontiers whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at, or around the floating fortresses, which guard strategic spots on the sea lanes. In the centers of civilization, war means no more than a continuous shortage of consumption goods and the occasional crash of a rocket bomb, which may cause a few scores of deaths. War has, in fact, changed its character. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed in their order of importance. Motives which were already present to some small extent in the great wars of the early 20th century have now become dominant and are consciously recognized and acted upon. To understand the nature of the present war, for in spite of the regrouping which occurs every few years, it is always the same war, one must realize in the first place that it is impossible for it to be decisive. None of the three superstates could be definitely conquered even by the other two in combination. They are too evenly matched, and their natural defenses are too formidable. Eurasia is protected by its vast land spaces, Oceania by the width of the Atlantic and the Pacific, East Asia by the fecundity and industriousness of its inhabitants. Secondly, there is no longer, in a material sense, anything to fight about. With the establishment of self-contained economies in which production and consumption are geared to one another, the scramble for markets, which was a main cause of previous wars, has come to an end, while the competition for raw materials is no longer a matter of life and death. In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast that it can obtain almost all of the materials that it needs within its own boundaries. Insofar as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is a war for labor power. Between the frontiers of the superstates, and not permanently in the possession of any of them, there lies a rough quadrilateral with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong, containing within it about a fifth of the population of the earth. It is for the possession of these thickly populated regions and of the northern ice cap that the three powers are constantly struggling. In practice, no one power ever controls the whole of the disputed area. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and it is the chance of seizing this or that fragment by a sudden stroke of treachery that dictates the endless changes of alignment. All of the disputed territories contain valuable minerals, and some of them yield important vegetable products such as rubber, which in colder climates it is necessary to synthesize by comparatively expensive methods. But above all, they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. Whichever power controls equatorial Africa or the countries of the Middle East or southern India or the Indonesian archipelago disposes also of the bodies of scores of hundreds of millions of ill-paid and hard-working coolies. The inhabitants of these areas, reduced more or less openly to the status of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror, and are expended like so much coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labor power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on indefinitely. It should be noted that the fighting never really moves beyond the edges of the disputed areas. The frontiers of Eurasia flow back and forth between the basin of the Congo and the northern shore of the Mediterranean. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are constantly being captured and recaptured by Oceania or by East Asia. In Mongolia, the dividing line between Eurasia and East Asia is never stable. Round the pole, all three powers lay claim to enormous territories which in fact are largely uninhabited and unexplored. But the balance of power always remains roughly even, and the territory which forms the heartland of each superstate always remains inviolate. Moreover, the labor of the exploited peoples round the equator is not really necessary to the world's economy. They add nothing to the wealth of the world, since whatever they produce is used for purposes of war, and the object of waging a war is always to be in a better position in which to wage another war. By their labor, the slave populations allow the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not exist, the structure of world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principles of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so even if no artificial processes of destruction had been at work. The world of today is a bare, hungry, dilapidated place compared with the world that existed before 1914, and still more so if compared with the imaginary future to which the people of that period looked forward. In the early 20th century, the vision of a future society unbelievably rich, leisured, orderly, and efficient, a glittering antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow-white concrete, was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at a prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. This failed to happen, partly because of the impoverishment caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partly because scientific and technical progress depended on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society. As a whole, the world is more primitive today than it was 50 years ago. Certain backward areas have advanced, and various devices, always in some way connected with warfare and police espionage, have been developed, but experiment and invention have largely stopped, and the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers inherent in the machine are still there. From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. And, in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute, the machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. But it was also clear that an all-round increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed in some sense was the destruction, of a hierarchical society. In a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an airplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxury, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice such a society could not long remain stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practical solution. It conflicted with the tendency toward mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world, and moreover any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense, and was bound to be dominated directly or indirectly by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened, to a great extent, during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation, capital equipment was not added to, great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by state charity. But this, too, entailed military weakness, and since the privations it inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they need not be distributed. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces, or pouring into the stratosphere, or sinking in the depths of the sea, materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed. A floating fortress, for example, has locked up in it the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately it is scrapped as obsolete, never having brought any material benefit to anybody, and with further enormous labors another floating fortress is built. In principle, the war effort is always so planned as to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. In practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges, and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. By the standards of the early 20th century, even a member of the inner party lives an austere, laborious kind of life. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better texture of his clothes, the better quality of his food and drink and tobacco, his 2 or 3 servants, his private motor car or helicopter, set him in a different world from a member of the outer party, and the members of the outer party have a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consequences of being at war, and therefore in danger, makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. What is concerned here is not the morale of the masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they are kept steadily at work, but the morale of the party itself. Even the humblest party member is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent within narrow limits, but it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic, whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgiastic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the mentality appropriate to a state of war. It does not matter whether the war is actually happening, and since no decisive victory is possible, it does not matter whether the war is going well or badly. All that is needed is that a state of war should exist. The splitting of the intelligence which the party requires of its members, and which is more easily achieved in an atmosphere of war, is now almost universal. But the higher up the ranks one goes, the more marked it becomes. It is precisely in the inner party that war hysteria and hatred of the enemy are strongest. In his capacity as an administrator, it is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious and is either not happening or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party member wavers for an instant in his mystical belief that the war is real, and that it is bound to end victoriously with Oceania, the undisputed master of the entire world. All members of the inner party believe in this coming conquest as an article of faith. It is to be achieved either by gradually acquiring more and more territory, and so building up an overwhelming preponderance of power, or by the discovery of some new and unanswerable weapon. The search for new weapons continues unceasingly, and is one of the very few remaining activities in which the inventive or speculative type of mind can find any outlet. In Oceania at the present day, science, in the old sense, has almost ceased to exist. In newspeak there is no word for science. The empirical method of thought on which all the scientific achievements of the past were founded is opposed to the most fundamental principles of Ingsoc. And even technological progress only happens when its products can in some way be used for the diminution of human liberty. In all the useful arts, the world is either standing still or going backwards. The fields are cultivated with horse plows, while books are written by machinery. But in matters of vital importance, meaning in effect war and police espionage, the empirical approach is still encouraged, or at least tolerated. The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth, and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. There are therefore two great problems which the party is concerned to solve. One is how to discover against his will what another human being is thinking, and the other is how to kill several 100 million people in a few seconds without giving warning beforehand. Insofar as scientific research still continues, this is its subject matter. The scientist of today is either a mixture of psychologist and inquisitor, studying with extraordinary minuteness the meaning of facial expressions, gestures, and tones of voice, and testing the truth-producing effects of drug, shock therapy, hypnosis, and physical torture, or he is a chemist, physicist, or biologist concerned only with such branches of his special subject as are relevant to the taking of life. In the vast laboratories of the Ministry of Peace, and in the experimental stations hidden in the Brazilian forests, or in the Australian desert, or on lost islands of the Antarctic, the teams of experts are indefatigably at work. Some are concerned simply with planning the logistics of future wars, others devise larger and larger rocket bombs, more and more powerful explosives, and more impenetrable armor plating. Others search for new and deadlier gases, or for soluble poisons capable of being produced in such quantities as to destroy the vegetation of whole continents, or for breeds of disease germs immunized against all possible antibodies. Others strive to produce a vehicle that shall bore its way under the soil like a submarine under the water, or an airplane as independent of its base as a sailing ship. Others explore even remoter possibilities, such as focusing the sun's rays through lenses suspended thousands of kilometers away in space, or producing artificial earthquakes and tidal waves by tapping the heat at the Earth's center. But none of these projects ever comes anywhere near realization, and none of the three superstates ever gains a significant lead on the others. What is more remarkable is that all three powers already possess in the atomic bomb a weapon far more powerful than any that their present researchers are likely to discover. Although the party, according to its habit, claims the invention for itself, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s, and were first used on a large scale about 10 years later. At that time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped on industrial centers, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe, and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organized society, and hence of their own power. Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no more bombs were dropped. All three powers merely continue to produce atomic bombs and store them up against the decisive opportunity which they all believe will come sooner or later. And meanwhile the art of war has remained almost stationary for 30 or 40 years. Helicopters are more used than they were formerly. Bombing planes have been largely superseded by self-propelled projectiles, and the fragile, movable battleship has given way to the almost unsinkable floating fortress. But otherwise there has been little development. The tank, the submarine, the torpedo, the machine gun, even the rifle and the hand grenade are still in use. And in spite of the endless slaughters reported in the press and on the telescreens, the desperate battles of earlier wars, in which thousands or even millions of men were often killed in a few weeks, have never been repeated. None of the three superstates ever attempts any maneuver which involves the risk of serious defeat. When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack against an ally. The strategy that all three powers are following, or pretend to themselves that they are following, is the same. The plan is, by a combination of fighting, bargaining, and well-timed strokes of treachery, to acquire a ring of bases completely encircling one or other of the rival states, and then to sign a pact of friendship with that rival and remain on peaceful terms for so many years as to lull suspicion to sleep. During this time, rockets loaded with atomic bombs can be assembled at all the strategic spots. Finally, they will all be fired simultaneously, with effect so devastating as to make retaliation impossible. It will then be time to sign a pact of friendship with the remaining world power in preparation for another attack. This scheme, it is hardly necessary to say, is a mere daydream, impossible of realization. Moreover, no fighting ever occurs except in the disputed areas round the equator and the pole. No invasion of enemy territory is ever undertaken. This explains the fact that in some places the frontiers between the superstates are arbitrary. Eurasia, for example, could easily conquer the British Isles, which are geographically part of Europe, or, on the other hand, it would be possible for Oceania to push its frontiers to the Rhine, or even to the Vistula. But this would violate the principle, followed on all sides, though never formulated, of cultural integrity. If Oceania were to conquer the areas that used once to be known as France and Germany, it would be necessary either to exterminate the inhabitants, a task of great physical difficulty, or to assimilate a population of about 100 million people, who, so far as technical development goes, are roughly on the oceanic level. The problem is the same for all three superstates. It is absolutely necessary to their structure that there should be no contact with foreigners, except to a limited extent with war prisoners and colored slaves. Even the official ally of the moment is always regarded with the darkest suspicion. War prisoners apart, the average citizen of Oceania never sets eyes on a citizen of either Eurasia or Eastasia, and he is forbidden the knowledge of foreign languages. If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself, and that most of what he has been told about them is lies. The sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his morale depends might evaporate. It is therefore realized on all sides that however often Persia, or Egypt, or Java, or Ceylon may change hands, the main frontiers must never be crossed by anything except bombs. Under this lies a fact never mentioned aloud, but tacitly understood and acted upon. Namely, that the conditions of life in all three superstates are very much the same. In Oceania, the prevailing philosophy is called Ingsoc. In Eurasia, it is called Neo-Bolshevism, and in Eastasia, it is called by a Chinese name, usually translated as death worship, but perhaps better rendered as obliteration of the self. The citizen of Oceania is not allowed to know anything of the tenets of the other two philosophies, but he is taught to execrate them as barbarous outrages upon morality and common sense. Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and the social systems which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramidal structure, the same worship of a semi-divine leader, the same economy existing by and for continuous warfare. It follows that the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop one another up, like three sheaves of corn. And, as usual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they are doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. Meanwhile, the fact that there is no danger of conquest makes possible the denial of reality, which is the special feature of Ingsoc and its rival systems of thought. Here it is necessary to repeat what has been said earlier, that by becoming continuous, war has fundamentally changed its character. In past ages, a war, almost by definition, was something that sooner or later came to an end, usually in unmistakable victory or defeat. In the past also, war was one of the main instruments by which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. All rulers of all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency. So long as defeat meant the loss of independence, or some other result generally held to be undesirable, the precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy, or religion, or ethics, or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5, but when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. Newspapers and history books were, of course, always colored and biased, but falsification of the kind that is practiced today would have been impossible. War was a sure safeguard of sanity, and so far as the ruling classes were concerned, it was probably the most important of all safeguards. While wars could be won or lost, no ruling class could be completely irresponsible. But when war becomes literally continuous, it also ceases to be dangerous. When war is continuous, there is no such thing as military necessity. Technical progress can cease, and the most palpable facts can be denied or disregarded. As we have seen, researches that could be called scientific are still carried out for the purposes of war, but they are essentially a kind of daydreaming, and their failure to show results is not important. Efficiency, even military efficiency, is no longer needed. Nothing is efficient in Oceania except the thought police. Since each of the three superstates is unconquerable, each is in effect a separate universe, within which almost any perversion of thought can be safely practiced. Reality only exerts its pressure through the needs of everyday life, the need to eat and drink, to get shelter and clothing, to avoid swallowing poison or stepping out of top-story windows, and the like. Between life and death, and between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact with the outer world and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space, who has no way of knowing which direction is up and which is down. The rulers of such a state are absolute, as the pharaohs or the Caesars could not be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient, and they are obliged to remain at the same low level of military technique as their rivals, but once that minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose. The war, therefore, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, is merely an imposture. It is like the battles between certain ruminant animals whose horns are set at such an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It eats up the surplus of consumable goods, and it helps to preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interest and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. It would probably be accurate to say that by becoming continuous, war has ceased to exist. The peculiar pressure that it exerted on human beings between the Neolithic age and the early 20th century has disappeared, and has been replaced by something quite different. The effect would be much the same if the three superstates, instead of fighting one another, should agree to live in perpetual peace, each inviolate within its own boundaries. For in that case each would still be a self-contained universe, freed forever from the sobering influence of external danger. A peace that was truly permanent would be the same as a permanent war. This, although the vast majority of party members understand it only in a shallower sense, is the inner meaning of the party slogan, "War is peace." Winston stopped reading for a moment. Somewhere in the remote distance a rocket bomb thundered. The blissful feeling of being alone with a forbidden book in a room with no telescreen had not worn off. Solitude and safety were physical sensations, mixed up somehow with the tiredness of his body, the softness of the chair, the touch of the faint breeze from the window that played upon his cheek. The book fascinated him, or more exactly, it reassured him. In a sense it told him nothing that was new, but that was part of the attraction. It said what he would have said if it had been possible for him to set his scattered thoughts in order. It was the product of a mind similar to his own, but enormously more powerful, more systematic, less fear-ridden. The best books, he perceived, are those that tell you what you know already. He had just turned back to Chapter 1 when he heard Julia's footstep on the stair and started out of his chair to meet her. She dumped her brown tool bag on the floor and flung herself into his arms. It was more than a week since they had seen one another. "I've got the book," he said, as they disentangled themselves. "Oh, you've got it. Good," she said, without much interest, and almost immediately knelt down beside the oil stove to make the coffee. They did not return to the subject until they had been in bed for half an hour. The evening was just cool enough to make it worthwhile to pull up the counterpane. From below came the familiar sound of singing and the scrape of boots on the flagstones. The brawny, red-armed woman whom Winston had seen there on his first visit was almost a fixture in the yard. There seemed to be no hour of daylight when she was not marching to and fro between the washtub and the line, alternately gagging herself with clothes pegs and breaking forth into lusty song. Julia had settled down on her side and seemed to be already on the point of falling asleep. He reached out for the book, which was lying on the floor, and sat up against the bedhead. "We must read it," he said. "You too, all members of the Brotherhood, have to read it." "You read it," she said with her eyes shut. "Read it aloud, that's the best way. Then you can explain it to me as you go." The clock's hands said 6, meaning 18. They had 3 or 4 hours ahead of them. He propped the book against his knees and began reading. Chapter 1. Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic age, there have been 3 kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers as well as their attitude toward one another have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. "Julia, are you awake?" said Winston. "Yes, my love, I'm listening. Go on, it's marvelous." He continued reading. The aims of these 3 groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle which is the same in its main outlines recurs over and over again. For long periods the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrust the low back into their old position of servitude, and themselves become the high. Presently, a new middle group splits off from one of the other groups, or from both of them, and the struggle begins over again. Of the three groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there had been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is physically better off than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. By the late 19th century, the recurrences of this pattern had become obvious to many observers. There then arose schools of thinkers who interpreted history as a cyclical process and claimed to show that inequality was the unalterable law of human life. This doctrine, of course, had always had its adherents, but in the manner in which it was now put forward there was a significant change. In the past, the need for a hierarchical form of society had been the doctrine specifically of the high. It had been preached by kings and aristocrats, and by the priests, lawyers, and the like who were parasitical upon them, and it had generally been softened by promises of compensation in an imaginary world beyond the grave. The middle, so long as it was struggling for power, had always made use of such terms as freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, however, the concept of human brotherhood began to be assailed by people who were not yet in positions of command, but merely hoped to be so before long. In the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality, and then had established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. The new middle groups, in effect, proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, was still deeply infected by the utopianism of past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 onwards, the aim of establishing liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements, which appeared in the middle years of the century, Ingsoc in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Eurasia, death worship, as it was commonly called in East Asia, had the conscious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. These new movements, of course, grew out of the old ones and tended to keep their names and pay lip service to their ideology. But the purpose of all of them was to arrest progress and freeze history at a chosen moment. The familiar pendulum swing was to happen once more, and then stop. As usual, the high were to be turned out by the middle, who would then become the high, but this time, by conscious strategy, the high would be able to maintain their position permanently. The new doctrines arose partly because of the accumulation of historical knowledge, and the growth of the historical sense, which had hardly existed before the 19th century. The cyclical movement of history was now intelligible, or appeared to be so, and if it was intelligible, then it was alterable. But the principal underlying cause was that as early as the beginning of the 20th century, human equality had become technically possible. It was still true that men were not equal in their native talents, and that functions had to be specialized in ways that favored some individuals against others, but there was no longer any real need for class distinctions or for large differences of wealth. In earlier ages, class distinctions had been not only inevitable but desirable. Inequality was the price of civilization. With the development of machine production, however, the case was altered. Even if it was still necessary for human beings to do different kinds of work, it was no longer necessary for them to live at different social or economic levels. Therefore, from the point of view of the new groups who were on the point of seizing power, human equality was no longer an ideal to be striven after, but a danger to be averted. In more primitive ages, when a just and peaceful society was in fact not possible, it had been fairly easy to believe in it. The idea of an earthly paradise in which men should live together in a state of brotherhood, without laws and without brute labor, had haunted the human imagination for thousands of years, and this vision had had a certain hold even on the groups who actually profited by each historic change. The heirs of the French, English, and American revolutions had partly believed in their own phrases about the rights of man, freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the like, and had even allowed their conduct to be influenced by them to some extent. But by the fourth decade of the 20th century, all the main currents of political thought were authoritarian.
Rhetorical ethic. Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Star 6 if you would like to participate. My apologies. I think my mic was open for a little bit during the audio headset. Cannot believe it. I didn't drop it. I didn't throw it down. White person, well, maybe a white person did do something to it when I wasn't looking, but I have no idea. Headset, that would be helpful. The number to dial, again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943 pound. Before we get to the dialogue, Pam and the co-authors, Trojan Horse, all of their great publications, Beauty Con Game, Black Love is a Revolutionary Act, they are doing a sale on the ebooks. You can visit the brand new website for their material, racismws.com, racismws.com. Book sale ends at midnight today, so you can check that out. Support the folks at Trojan Horse Publications. Outstanding counter-racist effort. All right. I will hit the phone lines. Interesting dialogue. Looking forward to hearing input from folks out there. Participate. We will share for the next 35 minutes, and then we'll get back to the audio. So don't wait until the last minute. If you have comments, get your hand up. I do see the two folks. I'll get the two hands. There was one thing I was going to say, and that was the portion at the very beginning of the audio this week where Winston, he says, everyone in the records department worked 18 hours in the 24 with 2 3-hour snatches of sleep. Very beginning of the audio this week. I thought that should sound very familiar for a lot of folks out there who are on the plantation, dealing with white people, racist man, racist woman, being terrorized for, maybe 18 out of 24 hours. Maybe you don't work quite that much. Hopefully you don't work quite that much. But then coming home and trying to get your brain computer working and understanding the system of oppression. I thought that would sound familiar to many folks out there. Caller 0218, your line is open, and our Brooklyn caller, your line is open as well.
Greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What I've realized from this, from listening to this portion of 1984, is how much I missed. That went over my head when I was reading it in high school. I didn't realize how powerful and how revealing the truth that he was telling. That he was telling on this book. And what stood out to me was when he was reading the book, the first chapter, when he was talking about the 3 classes in society. It reminded me of our current system that we have here in the U.S. The very rich, the middle class and the lower class, and and then when he said that how no matter what happens, whether there be a war or revolution, everything always goes back to the same societal hierarchy, and that was just very, very revealing to me. And I was under the impression that maybe someday we all could be equal, but now it all seems more like a utopia, and it just made me realize, how the aims of these three classes are just very, very different from one another, and that they can never be reconcilable. I think that's what he used, and I kind of knew that, but it just, just hearing it, just added a whole level of twist and understanding to it for me, and that's pretty much all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Greetings, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Gus, and the callers, of course. You can hear you? Yeah, thinking about what the caller was saying, just how social mobility kind of becomes like, instead of something to help people to achieve this, a society where everyone can have all their needs be met, it's more of something to stop that from happening. Like, these people wind up like, I forget, somebody was talking about an analogy of how we're like the pennies in the bottle, and they turn the bottle upside down, and then only one penny can get into the bottleneck, and that keeps all the other pennies from coming through. So it's like the social mobility myth just kind of becomes something to keep everyone else from getting what they need, instead of something actually to help people get their needs met. It's like a carrot on a stick. Like, it just becomes like politics just for politics, instead of politics towards some kind of human goal, And it's like, Al Sharpton, he's on NBC, and it's like the only black male, who kind of sounds like, he's got some angst in his voice, but, he's got the conked hair, and, he's real, like, he's probably propped up by white people, more power to him, but, we live in a system of white supremacy. A few things I wrote down, like where it says, war is waged by each nation against its own subjects, and it's like the blank spot in this book is just like, there's no, early in the book it says something about how, like, Oceania is composed of, like, there's no, like, division between whatever ethnicities, so-called, or, like, people with different skin color. I think they alluded to something about that earlier, but obviously, this is obviously white supremacy, with all the references to whiteness, or, like, it says something about Snow White, and referencing white as being good, and stuff like that. And the references to the machine, how the machine was the way that everybody was getting up, in society. The machine was this promise of where everybody had their refrigerator and their car and whatever, and the machine was helping everybody to pull themselves up out of this whatever situation where they couldn't get their needs met. But it's like, I'm thinking the machine kind of like, now I've heard the show previously. The program where, Gus, you're talking about one of your favorite books is the Invisible Man, and all the references to black people being the machine, and then where we know, like, modern findings in electricity and stuff, where the human body is this electrically conductive body, and how how important having melanin is to functioning, and just as black people are the machine basically that's running society, but we aren't the humans. The humans are enjoying the advances that the machine gives to them, because the machine isn't a human and humans aren't machines. So I think the machine is a reference to black people, maybe subconsciously. And where he says the higher up the ranks one goes, the more danger there is, because you have to rally, you have to kind of have that. He says that have some type of almost. He said religious. He didn't say religious, but he said mystical. You have to have this mystical kind of belief in the system. I'm thinking about Obama, how the way he talks. It's just all this language, like he's writing poetry, and it all sounds real good and everything if you're not really listening to it. But it doesn't really. It's kind of like just the logic of the system kind of coming through someone who has to say what they're saying. They even have to believe it. So it's mystical. So I was thinking about Obama with that. One more thing, how he says the fighting never goes beyond the boundaries of any one territory, and that's how the power balance is maintained, because there's the constant war, but the war never goes to where any one side is going to win, because that would mean the end to the war. So it has to stay. The war has to remain within these boundaries of each of these three nations. And I'm thinking about the book as being within the context of that. This book is being written within the context of this war that it's describing. So it's the book actually couldn't break the boundaries. The book can't fully describe the system, or else it would actually help the system to end. So the book has to kind of remain it can't describe the system well enough to destroy it, but it's just enough for you to realize the futility of going against it, I guess, in a weird way. It's entertaining to people that are in the system, because they already know that they're not going to stop the system from being in place if they've already accepted the fact that either you're a non-white victim and you don't have enough power to stop the system, or you're a white racist white supremacist, in which case you are the system. So I guess just how you could read it in different ways, but I relating to that, I don't know if anyone read back in the day, Aldous Huxley wrote A Brave New World, and his brother was actually a genetic scientist. Now, The Brave New World, his book Brave New World, is similar to 1984 in that it describes a future where everything is very much planned by the government, or whatever you want to call them, these people that are higher up, they're in charge of everybody else. But there's no sexual reproduction. Everything is, everybody's a test tube. Everybody, there's no actual sexual reproduction. Every single baby is produced inside of a laboratory, and so they produce people to be the highest level of people. So they produce people in the laboratory to be very intelligent, or they produce them to be sort of middle intelligent and very strong, so they can be good workers. They produce people to be very stupid and whatever, and then everyone takes drugs so they can be happy or to be smart, and everything is very controlled. But Aldous Huxley, who wrote this book, his brother was a genetic researcher in America. Aldous Huxley, the same as Orwell, I think, is from England. But it's just that these people that are writing these books they're not just like thinking about this stuff. Like these people are deeply in the system. Like they are, these people are not just writing these fanciful tales. Like these people are writing these books based on an intimate knowledge of the system. So I would just suggest that people read it thinking about it like that.
Absolutely. I touched on before Orwell. He worked for the BBC and watched all the things that went down with World War II, Hitler. So absolutely, they're not just making this stuff up. They observed this sort of thing, just an earlier version of the system of white supremacy. And also the connection, Huxley taught George Orwell in his younger days, before he wrote 1984. So big connection between those texts. Same genre, that dystopian view where things are very bleak in the future. If I understood one of your points when you were saying about the book, that if I understood you correctly, I'm paraphrasing, that the book that Winston is reading that is explaining the unjust world and how it works to some degree, you were saying that because it's published within the confines of that unjust system, the book can't really accurately explain it. Like it can only go so far because it's published within the confines of the system. Did I understand that point correctly?
Yes, but there's a little bit more to it. I think I was also but also I think this book, 1984, that we are reading, also, but yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna expand, since you said this book would also fall to that same flaw. Would any book, Mr. Fuller's book, ISIS paper, would any book qualify, or would any book have that same flaw? Published within a system, it is going to fail to accurately capture the system just by the fact that it's published within that system.
I guess it would have to, because the system is still very much in place.
Just one to ponder, particularly as this book evolves. I think the symbolism of books or stories where there is an actual code book or manual on behavior with regards to either a code book about how to practice injustice. In Manderley, there's an actual code book on how to practice white supremacy. It's stunning. But stories like that have there is a code book in it, I pay very close attention to those type stories. The world seems to think they're important stories where there's an important book, the Bible. But yeah, I think just paying attention to how this will evolve. The color, he talked about the book being black when he went to begin reading it. I thought that stood out. Yeah, just the book. We can talk about that more as this evolves and we see more about the book, get more about the story. If folks have thoughts on that as well, any books published in a system of injustice, how much they can actually capture the system that they're in is something to think about. On page 97, I did want to share this. I thought this was very important. There were many portions that were very important. We have about another 15 minutes left, so if you think you have something you want to share, get your hand up now. I'm going to go to the audio in about 15 minutes. This is on page 97 of the PDF. He writes, "All rulers in all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency. So long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable, the precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5. But when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. I think quite a significant passage. Do y'all have any thoughts on that? How that might apply to what white people do?
I got a quick question before we move on that. To the caller's point about how any book that is written within the system is bound to fail, or any ideology that might be espoused in whatever book that is published within the system. Is it bound to fail because there's not enough people that know about it, or is it bound to fail because there's nothing we can do about it, no matter the number of people who may believe in that whatever ideology, whether it be the Code Book or Dr. Wells' things or white supremacist handbook? That was my question. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
so are you saying it? Well, I kind of feel like I was agreeing with Gus when Gus asked if he could expand it to include all books. So I think that question might be for Gus. I was just agreeing with Gus.
Well, I thought you were the one who brought up that question first, and then Gus, expanded on it. I was wondering what was your opinion on that? Do you think any solution that may come from any non-white people on how to combat the system of white supremacy is bound to fail? Do you think it's due because there's not enough of us that are codified or conscious enough of the system that we are in, that it's bound to fail, or is it because no matter how big our numbers may be, there's nothing we can do about it because white supremacy is the rule of the land, and there's nothing that can be done about it? Because it sounded to me like, it sounded to me like it was very pessimistic in your view, like it can't, like white supremacy can't be replaced.
Well, I guess what it is that
that's how it came across your question.
I think I hear what you're saying. Well, I guess I think what it comes down to is, like, are we in a system of white supremacy or not? Because if it's a system of white supremacy and not just an incident or a few disconnected, instances of white supremacy, if it's a system, then that means that, like, it's like the difference between cancer and a sniffle. So, like, I mean, it's pretty serious if it's a system of white supremacy. I mean, that's kind of, that would mean that it wouldn't just be like, a matter of, rallying a few people together and getting a few people to change their minds. I mean, it just kind of speaks to the truth of the weight of the thing, So, I would like for things to be less bleak, on a regular basis. But I think that, or it seems like it's going to take a little bit more than just let me think for a second. Let me think.
While you're thinking, we had another caller join the line. If you wanted to share your thoughts, your line should be open. 9325.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have to say, wow, on that. It's a lot of material that's covered in that, but I have some notes that I've taken earlier. One, I wanted to mention that George Orwell had briefly worked for the British Imperial Police. During that time, he was stationed in Burma, and I think you mentioned it before in one of his books, Burmese Days, and I think that has some influence on some of his writing here, because I did some research and found that I think he was practicing racism while he was in Burma. He had a mistress there, and I think that his dealings with her changed some of his ideas, and he didn't spend very long with the Imperial Police. But then, with that knowledge, as I look at some of his writings, I can see, why he does certain things that he does in his writing style. Because I've noticed that when he's referring to the others or anybody other than in the two nations that are basically white, then they're shown in a negative light. For instance, one of the words, fecundity, I can hardly pronounce the word, but it's Fecundity. If you look that up, he's referring to the Asian people as, actually overproducing or, multiplying greatly. He also refers to them as ill-paid, working coolies. And if you look the word up, coolies, it was a derogatory term used towards Asian people during that time in the 1940s or early 50s. But also, when he breaks down, and the book is breaking down basically what the Oceania's government is made up as. And it's a pyramid where the top 2%, the inner party, is the ones with the most power. The 85% of the pros are the low class, which are, they have the less power. So that leaves approximately 13% to be the outer part, which that's where Winston falls in. And while he's reading the book, I think he's going to become disenchanted because he has some hope, which brings me back to, I looked up what the golden country in his dreams would symbolize. And the golden country, when he's dreaming about the landscaping, would symbolize hope for the future. So I think Winston has some hope, but by reading this book, I think some of that's going to be dashed because it's painting a bleak picture here. Also looked up the rhymes. The rhyme seems to be made up so that they could remember the past, because the past is being obliterated. So the oranges and the lemons are non-existent. They try to keep that in the forefront of their mind, along with the churches and the bells. When the churches are no longer a part of the society, but through the rhymes they can remember these things. I think that's where that falls in. But also what I've gotten out is that when you have a certain group of people that are controlling the power base, then you would basically have only 4 ways that things could possibly change. And one way is for that power, those percentage of people, to be overthrown by an outside force. And I relate this to racism, white supremacy, because they are the most powerful people right now that's controlling everything. The middle class can rebel, number two. Or number three, the masses could overthrow them. That would be a combination of the middle class and the lower. But like the book pointed out, the lower class will always come out on the bottom. And then last but not least, the higher class would lose the confidence or the will to govern. So basically just give up the power. And when we're dealing with a system of white supremacy, I basically really don't see that happen. So those are some of the notes that I have. Thank you.
Absolutely. We have about 5 minutes left. Great observations. Stimulate the brain computer. If you think you want to share on this side of the audio, you should go ahead and get your hand up right now. If you would rather wait until we finish the second audio clip and then participate, feel free to do so then as well. But about 5 minutes left.
I got another comment.
Hang on one second. I wanted to read one quick section and then feel free to share your next comment. This is on page, I guess PDF, page 93. Page 93. So many things stood out with regards to what is being written in the book Winston is reading applies to the way white people practice white supremacy. Where it says even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting them to fire. White people do this. They have a video of them doing this. Just wasteful, blatantly wasteful. But a little bit up, same page, he writes, in practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. Very significant passage, I thought, particularly if you think about that and have that image. The metaphor that I think the Brooklyn caller shared earlier about the pennies trying to get through a bottleneck with that passage that I just read, having those two together. Right on. The caller that wanted to share?
Yes, sir. I have two statements and a question. First statement is I thought that it was very revealing that Julia didn't show too much interest in she didn't show the same enthusiasm that Winston shared when he told her that he was that he got the book. And number two is this could be a potential spoiler. I think that when I read the book, I think that in the end, I think Julia ended up betraying him, if I'm not mistaken. And that she was in on it all along, but I could be incorrect, but I think that's what might happen. I think that's what might have happened when I last read it, but I'm not too sure. And the question that I have is, do y'all think that George Orwell is willfully practicing racism by reading a book that's painting a very bleak picture of the future, so that there will be no resistance to change whatever the ruling government or whatever system of injustice that's currently in place?
Yeah.
What you, Gus, and the other male caller?
My view, and I will have to think about this some more, but my view would be that I think the book can be racist, and I think that Mr. Orwell, I suspect that he was a racist, and that his racist white supremacist practice is being manifest in the book that he wrote, in all of the books that he's written, Burmese Days. But I don't know if I think the novel being so bleak, I don't know if I would say that that is necessarily a manifestation of his white supremacy racism, because I think that is the way that this book concludes, the way that it's written, the way that it concludes. I think that's just the way that white people think. This system is going to march on into oblivion, and there's absolutely nothing that can be done to stop the white juggernaut. That's just the way that they think. So I think, I think that's just the way that I look at it. Not that I think, oh wow, reading this book is depressing and there's nothing can be done. Just that's the way that white people think. That's the way that, that is their mindset, where it says, I think the caller earlier where he said the high group, sometimes they'll lose the will to rule. That is not white people. They are never falling asleep on being dedicated. I think Mr. Orwell used that word in describing this, dedication to dominating non-white people. So yeah, that's my thoughts, if that makes sense. We have about a minute left and we're going to the audio. Did the other caller, did you want to respond to the question on the floor? (9325), did you want to respond to that question about the novel being racist because it's got such a bleak perspective on things?
Yes, I believe the novel is racist, and I think that it's coming out, in his color symbolism, in the words that he used, his ideas. And I don't know about being bleak. I think it seems accurate. A lot of stuff that he's talking about in the book, especially the part about the airplanes, during war, the Vietnam War, they pushed a lot of tanks and armor and guns and everything into the rivers. They were sitting at the bottom of the river. So creating this scarcity, a surplus, and then creating shortages. It's all that's, everything that he's saying is somewhat accurate. He described almost everything into the future except the drones, and then, well, we can't really expect for him to foresee that. But almost everything else, the satellite imagery, he was pretty much right on everything that he was saying. And then the wars not being won, and they wasn't even designed to be won. It's just to get material. Yeah, to gain material resources, and then to get even more labor. Because it seems like after every war, there's an influx of the people that we were at war with, and then it's, I don't see it as bleak. I see it as stimulating and also very informative. That's my take on it.
Right on. Greetings to the person in the background as well. We can hear them chiming in. Appreciate it. We will get to the second portion to make sure that we have time to share after that is all done. As I said, by the time you get to the end of the book, the way that you feel about the book and what Orwell is suggesting. Oh, I'm echoing a little bit. Okay. I'll open all the lines back up once we're done with the second portion of the audio. But yeah, keep that in mind as we get deeper into the book, what Orwell is suggesting about books that are supposed to be against a system of injustice within that system, as we were talking about. Keep that in mind as we continue with the book, because that'll very meaningful. Number 2, George Orwell, 1984, Context of White Supremacy.
The earthly paradise had been discredited at exactly the moment when it became realizable. Every new political theory, by whatever name it called itself, led back to hierarchy and regimentation. And in the general hardening of outlook that set in round about 1930, practices which had long been abandoned, in some cases for hundreds of years, imprisonment without trial, the use of war prisoners as slaves, public executions, torture to extract confessions, the use of hostages, and the deportation of whole populations, not only became common again, but were tolerated and even defended by people who considered themselves enlightened and progressive. It was only after a decade of national wars, civil wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions in all parts of the world that INGSOC and its rivals emerged as fully worked-out political theories. But they had been foreshadowed by the various systems generally called totalitarian which had appeared earlier in the century, and the main outlines of the world which would emerge from the prevailing chaos had long been obvious. What kind of people would control this world has been equally obvious. The new aristocracy was made up for the most part of bureaucrats, scientists, technicians, trade union organizers, publicity experts, sociologists, teachers, journalists, and professional politicians. These people, whose origins lay in the salaried middle class and the upper grades of the working class, had been shaped and brought together by the barren world of monopoly industry and centralized government. As compared with their opposite numbers in past ages, they were less avaricious, less tempted by luxury, hungrier for pure power, and above all, more conscious of what they were doing and more intent on crushing opposition. This last difference was cardinal. By comparison with that existing today, all the tyrannies of the past were half-hearted and inefficient. The ruling groups were always infected to some extent by liberal ideas and were content to leave loose ends everywhere, to regard only the overt act and to be uninterested in what their subjects were thinking. Even the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages was tolerant by modern standards. Part of the reason for this was that in the past no government had the power to keep its citizens under constant surveillance. The invention of print, however, made it easier to manipulate public opinion, and the film and the radio carried the process further. With the development of television and the technical advance which made it possible to receive and transmit simultaneously on the same instrument, private life came to an end. Every citizen, or at least every citizen important enough to be worth watching, could be kept for 24 hours a day under the eyes of the police and in the sound of official propaganda, with all other channels of communication closed. The possibility of enforcing not only complete obedience to the will of the state, but complete uniformity of opinion on all subjects now existed for the first time. After the revolutionary period of the 50s and 60s, society regrouped itself, as always, into high, middle, and low. But the new high group, unlike all its forerunners, did not act upon instinct, but knew what was needed to safeguard its position. It had long been realized that the only secure basis for oligarchy is collectivism. Wealth and privilege are most easily defended when they are possessed jointly. The so-called abolition of private property, which took place in the middle years of the century, meant in effect the concentration of property in far fewer hands than before, but with this difference, that the new owners were a group instead of a mass of individuals. Individually, no member of the party owns anything except petty personal belongings. Collectively, the party owns everything in Oceania, because it controls everything and disposes of the products as it thinks fit. In the years following the revolution, it was able to step into this commanding position almost unopposed, because the whole process was represented as an act of collectivization. It had always been assumed that if the capitalist class were expropriated, socialism must follow. And unquestionably the capitalists had been expropriated. Factories, mines, land, houses, transport, everything had been taken away from them. And since these things were no longer private property, it followed that they must be public property. INGSOC, which grew out of the earlier socialist movement and inherited its phraseology, has in fact carried out the main item in the socialist program, with the result, foreseen and intended beforehand, that economic inequality has been made permanent. But the problems of perpetuating a hierarchical society go deeper than this. There are only 4 ways in which a ruling group can fall from power. Either it is conquered from without, or it governs so inefficiently that the masses are stirred to revolt, or it allows a strong and discontented middle group to come into being, or it loses its own self-confidence and willingness to govern. These causes do not operate singly, and as a rule all 4 of them are present in some degree. A ruling class which could guard against all of them would remain in power permanently. Ultimately, the determining factor is the mental attitude of the ruling class itself. After the middle of the present century, the first danger had in reality disappeared. Each of the 3 powers which now divide the world is in fact unconquerable, and could only become conquerable through slow demographic changes which a government with wide powers can easily avert. The second danger also is only a theoretical one. The masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. The recurrent economic crises of past times were totally unnecessary, and are not now permitted to happen. But other and equally large dislocations can and do happen without having political results, because there is no way in which discontent can become articulate. As for the problem of overproduction, which has been latent in our society since the development of machine technique, it is solved by the device of continuous warfare, see Chapter 3, which is also useful in keying up public morale to the necessary pitch. From the point of view of our present rulers, therefore, the only genuine dangers are the splitting off of a new group of able, underemployed, power-hungry people, and the growth of liberalism and skepticism in their own ranks. The problem, that is to say, is educational. It is a problem of continuously molding the consciousness both of the directing group and of the larger executive group that lies immediately below it. The consciousness of the masses needs only to be influenced in a negative way. Given this background, one could infer, if one did not know it already, the general structure of oceanic society. At the apex of the pyramid comes Big Brother. Big Brother is infallible and all-powerful. Every success, every achievement, every victory, every scientific discovery, all knowledge, all wisdom, all happiness, all virtue are held to issue directly from his leadership and inspiration. Nobody has ever seen Big Brother. He is a face on the hoardings, a voice on the telescreen. We may be reasonably sure that he will never die, and there is already considerable uncertainty as to when he was born. Big Brother is the guise in which the party chooses to exhibit itself to the world. His function is to act as a focusing point for love, fear, and reverence, emotions which are more easily felt toward an individual than toward an organization. Below Big Brother comes the inner party, its numbers limited to 6 millions, or something less than 2% of the population of Oceania. Below the inner party comes the outer party, which, if the inner party is described as the brain of the state, may be justly likened to the hands. Below that come the dumb masses whom we habitually refer to as the proles, numbering perhaps 85% of the population. In the terms of our earlier classification, the proles are the low, for the slave populations of the equatorial lands who pass constantly from conqueror to conqueror are not a permanent or necessary part of the structure. In principle, membership in these 3 groups is not hereditary. The child of inner party parents is in theory not born into the inner party. Admission to either branch of the party is by examination, taken at the age of 16. Nor is there any racial discrimination or any marked domination of one province by another. Jews, Negroes, South Americans of pure Indian blood are to be found in the highest ranks of the party, and the administrators of any area are always drawn from the inhabitants of that area. In no part of Oceania do the inhabitants have the feeling that they are a colonial population ruled from a distant capital. Oceania has no capital, and its titular head is a person whose whereabouts nobody knows. Except that English is its chief lingua franca and Newspeak its official language, it is not centralized in any way. Its rulers are not held together by blood ties, but by adherence to a common doctrine. It is true that our society is stratified, and very rigidly stratified, on what at first sight appear to be hereditary lines. There is far less to and fro movement between the different groups than happened under capitalism, or even in the pre-industrial ages. Between the 2 branches of the party there is a certain amount of interchange, but only so much as will ensure that weaklings are excluded from the inner party, and that ambitious members of the outer party are made harmless by allowing them to rise. Proletarians, in practice, are not allowed to graduate into the party. The most gifted among them, who might possibly become nuclei of discontent, are simply marked down by the thought police and eliminated. But this state of affairs is not necessarily permanent, nor is it a matter of principle. The party is not a class in the old sense of the word. It does not aim at transmitting power to its own children as such. And if there were no other way of keeping the ablest people at the top, it would be perfectly prepared to recruit an entire new generation from the ranks of the proletariat. In the crucial years, the fact that the party was not a hereditary body did a great deal to neutralize opposition. The older kind of socialist who had been trained to fight against something called class privilege assumed that what is not hereditary cannot be permanent. He did not see that the continuity of an oligarchy need not be physical, nor did he pause to reflect that hereditary aristocracies have always been short-lived, whereas adoptive organizations, such as the Catholic Church, have sometimes lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. The essence of oligarchical rule is not father-to-son inheritance, but the persistence of a certain world view and a certain way of life, imposed by the dead upon the living. A ruling group is a ruling group so long as it can nominate its successors. The party is not concerned with perpetuating its blood, but with perpetuating itself. Who wields power is not important, provided that the hierarchical structure remains always the same. All the beliefs, habits, tastes, emotions, mental attitudes that characterize our time are really designed to sustain the mystique of the party and prevent the true nature of present-day society from being perceived. Physical rebellion, or any preliminary move toward rebellion, is at present not possible. From the proletarians nothing is to be feared. Left to themselves, they will continue from generation to generation and from century to century, working, breeding, and dying, not only without any impulse to rebel, but without the power of grasping that the world could be other than it is. They could only become dangerous if the advance of industrial technique made it necessary to educate them more highly. But since military and commercial rivalry are no longer important, the level of popular education is actually declining. What opinions the masses hold or do not hold is looked on as a matter of indifference. They can be granted intellectual liberty because they have no intellect. In a party member, on the other hand, not even the smallest deviation of opinion on the most unimportant subject can be tolerated. A party member lives from birth to death under the eye of the thought police. Even when he is alone, he can never be sure that he is alone. Wherever he may be, asleep or awake, working or resting, in his bath or in bed, he can be inspected without warning and without knowing that he is being inspected. Nothing that he does is indifferent. His friendships, his relaxations, his behavior towards his wife and children, the expression of his face when he is alone, the words he mutters in sleep, even the characteristic movements of his body are all jealously scrutinized. Not only any actual misdemeanor, but any eccentricity, however small, any change of habits, any nervous mannerism that could possibly be the symptom of an inner struggle is certain to be detected. He has no freedom of choice in any direction whatever. On the other hand, his actions are not regulated by law or by any clearly formulated code of behavior. In Oceania there is no law. Thoughts and actions which, when detected, mean certain death are not formally forbidden. And the endless purges, arrests, tortures, imprisonments, and vaporizations are not inflicted as punishment for crimes which have actually been committed, but are merely the wiping out of persons who might perhaps commit a crime at some time in the future. A party member is required to have not only the right opinions, but the right instincts. Many of the beliefs and attitudes demanded of him are never plainly stated, and could not be stated without laying bare the contradictions inherent in Ingsoc. If he is a person naturally orthodox, in newspeak a good thinker, he will in all circumstances know, without taking thought, what is the true belief or the desirable emotion. But in any case, an elaborate mental training, undergone in childhood in grouping itself round the newspeak words crimestop, black-white, and doublethink, makes him unwilling and unable to think too deeply on any subject whatever. A party member is expected to have no private emotions and no respites from enthusiasm. He is supposed to live in a continuous frenzy of hatred of foreign enemies and internal traitors, triumph over victories, and self-abasement before the power and wisdom of the party. The discontents produced by his bare, unsatisfying life are deliberately turned outwards and dissipated by such devices as the 2 minutes hate, and the speculations which might possibly induce a skeptical or rebellious attitude are killed in advance by his early acquired inner discipline. The first and simplest stage in the discipline, which can be taught even to young children, is called, in Newspeak, crimestop. Crimestop means the faculty of stopping short, as though by instinct, at the threshold of any dangerous thought. It includes the power of not grasping analogies, of failing to perceive logical errors, of misunderstanding the simplest arguments if they are inimical to ingsoc, and of being bored or repelled by any train of thought which is capable of leading in a heretical direction. Crimestop, in short, means protective stupidity. But stupidity is not enough. On the contrary, orthodoxy, in the full sense, demands a control over one's own mental processes as complete as that of a contortionist over his body. Oceanic society rests ultimately on the belief that Big Brother is omnipotent and that the party is infallible. But since in reality Big Brother is not omnipotent and the party is not infallible, there is a need for an unwearying moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. The key word here is black-white. Like so many Newspeak words, this word has two mutually contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it means the habit of impudently claiming that black is white, in contradiction of the plain facts. Applied to a party member, it means a loyal willingness to say that black is white when party discipline demands this. But it means also the ability to believe that black is white, and more, to know that black is white, and to forget that one has ever believed the contrary. This demands a continuous alteration of the past, made possible by the system of thought which really embraces all the rest, and which is known in Newspeak as doublethink. The alteration of the past is necessary for two reasons, one of which is subsidiary and, so to speak, precautionary. The subsidiary reason is that the party member, like the proletarian, tolerates present-day conditions partly because he has no standards of comparison. He must be cut off from the past, just as he must be cut off from foreign countries, because it is necessary for him to believe that he is better off than his ancestors and that the average level of material comfort is constantly rising. But by far the more important reason for the readjustment of the past is the need to safeguard the infallibility of the party. It is not merely that speeches, statistics, and records of every kind must be constantly brought up to date in order to show that the predictions of the party were in all cases right. It is also that no change of doctrine or in political alignment can ever be admitted, for to change one's mind, or even one's policy, is a confession of weakness. If, for example, Eurasia or Eastasia, whichever it may be, is the enemy today, then that country must always have been the enemy. And if the facts say otherwise, then the facts must be altered. Thus history is continuously rewritten. This day-to-day falsification of the past, carried out by the Ministry of Truth, is as necessary to the stability of the regime as the work of repression and espionage carried out by the Ministry of Love. The mutability of the past is the central tenet of ingsoc. Past events, it is argued, have no objective existence, but survive only in written records and in human memories. The past is whatever the records and the memories agree upon. And since the party is in full control of all records, and in equally full control of the minds of its members, it follows that the past is whatever the party chooses to make it. It also follows that, though the past is alterable, it never has been altered in any specific instance. For when it has been recreated in whatever shape is needed at the moment, then this new version is the past, and no different past can ever have existed. This holds good even when, as often happens, the same event has to be altered out of recognition several times in the course of a year. At all times the party is in possession of absolute truth, and clearly the absolute can never have been different from what it is now. It will be seen that the control of the past depends above all on the trading of memory. To make sure that all written records agree with the orthodoxy of the moment is merely a mechanical act, but it is also necessary to remember that events happened in the desired manner. And if it is necessary to rearrange one's memories, or to tamper with written records, then it is necessary to forget that one has done so. The trick of doing this can be learned like any other mental technique. It is learned by the majority of party members, and certainly by all who are intelligent as well as orthodox. In old speak, it is called, quite frankly, reality control. In new speak, it is called doublethink, although doublethink comprises much else as well. Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The party intellectual knows in which direction his memories must be altered. He therefore knows that he is playing tricks with reality. But by the exercise of doublethink, he also satisfies himself that reality is not violated. The process has to be conscious, or it would not be carried out with sufficient precision, but it also has to be unconscious, or it would bring with it a feeling of falsity and hence of guilt. Doublethink lies at the very heart of Ingsoc, since the essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to forget any fact that has become inconvenient, and then when it becomes necessary again to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as it is needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality which one denies, all this is indispensably necessary. Even in using the word doublethink, it is necessary to exercise doublethink. For by using the word, one admits that one is tampering with reality. By a fresh act of doublethink, one erases this knowledge, and so on, indefinitely, with the lie always one leap ahead of the truth. Ultimately, it is by means of doublethink that the party has been able, and may, for all we know, continue to be able for thousands of years, to arrest the course of history. All past oligarchies have fallen from power either because they ossified or because they grew soft. Either they became stupid and arrogant, failed to adjust themselves to changing circumstances and were overthrown, or they became liberal and cowardly, made concessions when they should have used force, and once again were overthrown. They fell, that is to say, either through consciousness or through unconsciousness. It is the achievement of the party to have produced a system of thought in which both conditions can exist simultaneously. And upon no other intellectual basis could the dominion of the party be made permanent. If one is to rule, and to continue ruling, one must be able to dislocate the sense of reality. For the secret of rulership is to combine a belief in one's own infallibility with the power to learn from past mistakes. It need hardly be said that the subtlest practitioners of doublethink are those who invented doublethink, and know that it is a vast system of mental cheating. In our society, those who have the best knowledge of what is happening are also those who are furthest from seeing the world as it is. In general, the greater the understanding, the greater the delusion. The more intelligent, the less sane. One clear illustration of this is the fact that war hysteria increases in intensity as one rises in the social scale. Those whose attitude toward the war is most nearly rational are the subject peoples of the disputed territories. To these people the war is simply a continuous calamity which sweeps to and fro over their bodies like a tidal wave. Which side is winning is a matter of complete indifference to them. They are aware that a change of overlordship means simply that they will be doing the same work as before for new masters, who treat them in the same manner as the old ones. The slightly more favored workers, whom we call the proles, are only intermittently conscious of the war. When it is necessary, they can be prodded into frenzies of fear and hatred, but when left to themselves, they are capable of forgetting for long periods that the war is happening. It is in the ranks of the party, and above all of the inner party, that the true war enthusiasm is found. World conquest is believed in most firmly by those who know it to be impossible. This peculiar linking together of opposites, knowledge with ignorance, cynicism with fanaticism, is one of the chief distinguishing marks of oceanic society. The official ideology abounds with contradictions, even when there is no practical reason for them. Thus, the party rejects and vilifies every principle for which the socialist movement originally stood, and it chooses to do this in the name of socialism. It preaches a contempt for the working class, unexampled for centuries past, and it dresses its members in a uniform which was at one time peculiar to manual workers, and was adopted for that reason. It systematically undermines the solidarity of the family, and it calls its leader by a name which is a direct appeal to the sentiments of family loyalty. Even the names of the four ministries by which we are governed exhibit a sort of impudence in their deliberate reversal of the facts. The Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary hypocrisy. They are deliberate exercises in doublethink. For it is only by reconciling contradictions that power can be retained indefinitely. In no other way could the ancient cycle be broken. If human equality is to be forever averted, if the high, as we have called them, are to keep their places permanently, then the prevailing mental condition must be controlled insanity. But there is one question which until this moment we have almost ignored. It is, why should human equality be averted? Supposing that the mechanics of the process have been rightly described, what is the motive for this huge, accurately planned effort to freeze history at a particular moment of time? Here we reach the central secret. As we have seen, the mystique of the party, and above all of the inner party, depends upon doublethink. But deeper than this lies the original motive, the never-questioned instinct that first led to the seizure of power and brought doublethink, the thought police, continuous warfare, and all the other necessary paraphernalia into existence afterwards. This motive really consists... Winston became aware of silence, as one becomes aware of a new sound. It seemed to him that Julia had been very still for some time past. She was lying on her side, naked from the waist upwards, with her cheek pillowed on her hand and one dark lock tumbling across her eyes. Her breast rose and fell slowly and regularly. "Julia." No answer. "Julia, are you awake?" No answer. She was asleep. He shut the book, put it carefully on the floor, lay down, and pulled the coverlet over both of them. He had still, he reflected, not learned the ultimate secret. He understood how. He did not understand why. Chapter 1, like Chapter 3, had not actually told him anything that he did not know. It had merely systematized the knowledge that he possessed already. But after reading it, he knew better than before that he was not mad. Being in a minority, even a minority of one, did not make you mad. There was truth, and there was untruth, and if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad. A yellow beam from the sinking sun slanted in through the window and fell across the pillow. He shut his eyes. The sun on his face and the girl's smooth body touching his own gave him a strong, sleepy, confident feeling. He was safe. Everything was all right. He fell asleep murmuring, "Sanity is not statistical," with the feeling that this remark contained in it a profound wisdom. Chapter 10. When he woke, it was with the sensation of having slept for a long time, but a glance at the old-fashioned clock told him that it was only 20:30. He lay dozing for a little while. Then the usual deep-lunged singing strung up from the yard below. "It was only an hopeless fancy, it passed like an April dye, but a look and a word and the dreams they stirred, they have stolen my heart away." The drivelling song seemed to have kept its popularity. You still heard it all over the place. It had outlived the hate song. Julia woke at the sound, stretched herself luxuriously, and got out of bed. "I'm hungry," she said. "Let's make some more coffee." "Damn, the stove's gone out and the water's cold." She picked the stove up and shook it. "There's no oil in it." "We can get some from old Charrington, I expect." "The funny thing is, I made sure it was full." "I'm going to put my clothes on," she added. "It seems to have got colder." Winston also got up and dressed himself. The indefatigable voice sang on. "They say that time heals all things. They say you can always forget. But the smiles and the tears across the years, they twist my heartstrings yet." As he fastened the belt of his overalls, he strolled across to the window. The sun must have gone down behind the houses. It was not shining into the yard any longer. The flagstones were wet, as though they had just been washed, and he had the feeling that the sky had been washed too, so fresh and pale was the blue between the chimney pots. Tirelessly the woman marched to and fro, corking and uncorking herself, singing and fallen silent, and pegging out more diapers, and yet more. He wondered whether she took in washing for a living, or was merely the slave of 20 or 30 grandchildren. Julia had come across to his side. Together they gazed down with a sort of fascination at the sturdy figure below. As he looked at the woman in her characteristic attitude, her thick arms reaching up for the line, her powerful mare-like buttocks protruded, it struck him for the first time that she was beautiful. It had never before occurred to him that the body of a woman of 50, blown up to monstrous dimensions by childbearing, then hardened, roughened by work till it was coarse in the grain like an overripe turnip, could be beautiful. But it was so. And after all, he thought, why not? The solid, contourless body, like a block of granite, and the rasping red skin bore the same relation to the body of a girl as the rose hip to the rose. Why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower? "She's beautiful," he murmured. "She's a meter across the hips, easily," said Julia. "That is her style of beauty," said Winston. He held Julia's supple waist, easily encircled by his arm. From the hip to the knee her flank was against his. Out of their bodies no child would ever come. That was the one thing they could never do. Only by word of mouth, from mind to mind, could they pass on the secret. The woman down there had no mind. She had only strong arms, a warm heart, and a fertile belly. He wondered how many children she had given birth to. It might easily be 15. She had had her momentary flowering, a year perhaps of wild rose beauty, and then she had suddenly swollen like a fertilized fruit and grown hard and red and coarse, and then her life had been laundering, scrubbing, darning, cooking, sweeping, polishing, mending, scrubbing, laundering, first for children, then for grandchildren, over 30 unbroken years. At the end of it she was still singing. The mystical reverence that he felt for her was somehow mixed up with the aspect of the pale, cloudless sky stretching away behind the chimney pots into interminable distances. It was curious to think that the sky was the same for everybody, in Eurasia or East Asia as well as here. And the people under the sky were also very much the same, everywhere, all over the world. Hundreds or thousands of millions of people just like this, people ignorant of one another's existence, held apart by walls of hatred and lies, and yet almost exactly the same. People who had never learned to think, but were storing up in their hearts and bellies and muscles the power that would one day overturn the world. If there was hope, it lay in the proles. Without having read to the end of the book, he knew that that must be Goldstein's final message. The future belonged to the proles. And could he be sure that when their time came, the world they constructed would not be just as alien to him, Winston Smith, as the world of the party? Yes, because at the least it would be a world of sanity. Where there is equality, there can be sanity. Sooner or later it would happen. Strength would change into consciousness. The proles were immortal. You could not doubt it when you looked at that valiant figure in the yard. In the end their awakening would come, and until that happened, though it might be 1,000 years, they would stay alive against all the odds, like birds passing on from body to body the vitality which the party did not share and could not kill. "Do you remember," he said, "the thrush that sang to us that first day at the edge of the wood?" "He wasn't singing to us," said Julia. "He was singing to please himself. Not even that, he was just singing." The birds sang, the proles sang, the party did not sing. All round the world, in London and New York, in Africa and Brazil, and in the mysterious forbidden lands beyond the frontiers, in the streets of Paris and Berlin, in the villages of the endless Russian plain, in the bazaars of China and Japan, everywhere stood the same solid, unconquerable figure, made monstrous by work and childbearing, toiling from birth to death, and still singing. Out of those mighty loins a race of conscious beings must one day come. You were the dead, theirs was the future. But you could share in that future if you kept alive the mind as they kept alive the body, and passed on the secret doctrine that 2 + 2 make 4. "We are the dead," he said. "We are the dead," echoed Julia dutifully. "You are the dead," said an iron voice behind them. They sprang apart. Winston's entrails seemed to have turned into ice. He could see the white all round the irises of Julia's eyes. Her face had turned a milky yellow. The smear of rouge that was still on each cheekbone stood out sharply, almost as though unconnected with the skin beneath. "You are the dead," repeated the iron voice. "It was behind the picture," breathed Julia. "It was behind the picture," said the voice. "Remain exactly where you are. Make no movement until you are ordered." It was starting. It was starting at last. They could do nothing except stand gazing into one another's eyes. To run for life, to get out of the house before it was too late, no such thought occurred to them. Unthinkable to disobey the iron voice from the wall. There was a snap, as though a catch had been turned back, and a crash of breaking glass. The picture had fallen to the floor, uncovering the telescreen behind it. "Now they can see us," said Julia. "Now we can see you," said the voice. "Stand out in the middle of the room. Stand back to back. Clasp your hands behind your heads. Do not touch one another." They were not touching, but it seemed to him that he could feel Julia's body shaking, or perhaps it was merely the shaking of his own. He could just stop his teeth from chattering, but his knees were beyond his control. There was a sound of trampling boots below, inside the house and outside. The yard seemed to be full of men. Something was being dragged across the stones. The woman's singing had stopped abruptly. There was a long, rolling clang, as though the washtub had been flung across the yard, and then a confusion of angry shouts which ended in a yell of pain. "The house is surrounded," said Winston. "The house is surrounded," said the voice. He heard Julia snap her teeth together. "I suppose we may as well say goodbye," she said. "You may as well say goodbye," said the voice. And then another, quite different voice, a thin, cultivated voice, which Winston had the impression of having heard before, struck in. "And by the way, while we are on the subject, here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Something crashed on the bed behind Winston's back. The head of a ladder had been thrust through the window and had burst in the frame. Someone was climbing through the window. There was a stampede of boots up the stairs. The room was full of solid men in black uniforms with iron-shod boots on their feet and truncheons in their hands. Winston was not trembling any longer. Even his eyes he barely moved. One thing alone mattered: to keep still, and not give them an excuse to hit you. A man with a smooth prize-fighter's jowl, in which the mouth was only a slit, paused opposite him, balancing his truncheon meditatively between thumb and forefinger. Winston met his eyes. The feeling of nakedness with one's hands behind one's head and one's face and body all exposed was almost unbearable. The man protruded the tip of a white tongue, licked the place where his lips should have been, and then passed on. There was another crash. Someone had picked up the glass paperweight from the table and smashed it to pieces on the hearthstone. The fragment of coral, a tiny crinkle of pink, like a sugar rosebud from a cake, rolled across the mat. How small, thought Winston, how small it always was. There was a gasp and a thump behind him, and he received a violent kick on the ankle which nearly flung him off his balance. One of the men had smashed his fist into Julia's solar plexus, doubling her up like a pocket ruler. She was thrashing about on the floor, fighting for breath. Winston dared not turn his head even by a millimeter, but sometimes her livid, gasping face came within the angle of his vision. Even in his terror it was as though he could feel the pain in his own body, the deadly pain which nevertheless was less urgent than the struggle to get back her breath. He knew what it was like, the terrible, agonizing pain which was there all the while but could not be suffered yet, because before all else it was necessary to be able to breathe. Then two of the men hoisted her up by knees and shoulders and carried her out of the room like a sack. Winston had a glimpse of her face, upside down, yellow and contorted, with the eyes shut, and still with a smear of rouge on either cheek, and that was the last he saw of her. He stood dead still. No one had hit him yet. Thoughts which came of their own accord but seemed totally uninteresting began to flit through his mind. He wondered whether they had got Mr. Charrington. He wondered what they had done to the woman in the yard. He noticed that he badly wanted to urinate and felt a faint surprise because he had done so only 2 or 3 hours ago. He noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece said 9, meaning 21. But the light seemed too strong. Would not the light be fading at 21 hours on an August evening? He wondered whether, after all, he and Julia had mistaken the time, had slept the clock round and thought it was 20:30 when really it was not 8:30 on the following morning. But he did not pursue the thought further. It was not interesting. There was another, lighter step in the passage. Mr. Charrington came into the room. The demeanor of the black-uniformed men suddenly became more subdued. Something had also changed in Mr. Charrington's appearance. His eye fell on the fragments of the glass paperweight. "Pick up those pieces," he said sharply. A man stooped to obey. The Cockney accent had disappeared. Winston suddenly realized whose voice it was that he had heard a few moments ago on the telescreen. Mr. Charrington was still wearing his old velvet jacket, but his hair, which had been almost white, had turned black. Also, he was not wearing his spectacles. He gave Winston a single sharp glance, as though verifying his identity, and then paid no more attention to him. He was still recognizable, but he was not the same person any longer. His body had straightened and seemed to have grown bigger. His face had undergone only tiny changes that had nevertheless worked a complete transformation. The black eyebrows were less bushy, the wrinkles were gone, the whole lines of the face seemed to have altered, even the nose seemed shorter. It was the alert, cold face of a man of about 35. It occurred to Winston that for the first time in his life he was looking, with knowledge, at a member of the thought police. Part 3. He did not know where he was. Presumably he was in the Ministry of Love, but there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps flooded it with cold light, and there was a low, steady humming sound which he supposed had something to do with the air supply. A bench or shelf just wide enough to sit on ran round the wall, broken only by the door, and at the end opposite the door a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one in each wall. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might be 24 hours since he had eaten, it might be 36. He still did not know, probably never would know, whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat as still as he could on the narrow bench, with his hands crossed on his knee. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen. But the craving for food was growing upon him. What he longed for above all was a piece of bread. He had an idea that there were a few breadcrumbs in the pocket of his overalls. It was even possible, he thought this because from time to time something seemed to tickle his leg, that there might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame his fear. He slipped a hand into his pocket. "Smith!" yelled a voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Hands out of pockets in the cells. He sat still again, his hands crossed on his knee. Before being brought here, he had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or a temporary lock-up used by the patrols. He did not know how long he had been there. Some hours, at any rate. With no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him into a cell similar to the one he was in now, but filthily dirty and at all times crowded by 10 or 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there were a few political prisoners among them. He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies, too preoccupied by fear and the pain in his belly to take much interest in his surroundings, but still noticing the astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. The party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely when their belongings were impounded, wrote obscene words on the floor, ate smuggled food which they produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, called them by nicknames, and tried to wheedle cigarettes through the spy hole in the door. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, so long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. There were bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There were homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All the dirty jobs were done by the politicals.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. We have about 30 minutes left. Do not wait until the last minute. We should have 304, call in Brooklyn, and 9325. Your lines are all open.
Hey Gus, could I just wanted to, before, because my mind is kind of stuck on that one unfinished question of the I think 604, and then your question that never got answered. Do you think you could repeat your question from before?
My question, and I might not be restating it with the exact same words, but I think the gist of it was, since you were saying that the book 1984 is limited with regards to its ability to accurately describe, outline how a system of injustice, white supremacy works. And I said, would that be applicable to any and all books published under the system of white supremacy? Would they all have that same flaw of not being able to fully, accurately capture the system of injustice? I think that was pretty much the question.
But then there was another one after that kind of got skipped over. I guess it's not that important, perhaps, you know. But anyway, the other question that the other guy asked me if maybe I was being kind of pessimistic. I think I would like to use the way that Gus answered the question about whether or not George Orwell was practicing racism by writing such a kind of a somber book as 1984. Well, I just said yes, and Gus kind of elaborated on it, saying that it kind of displays the mind of white people, and I would say that is more accurately hits the question. Not that I answered it wrongly, but just that the elaboration, just that's the way the white people think, and I think you could get that from anywhere, anything in the system. You can just see how they're stuck on this like war and just despair, and just like that's just how they think. Like they call these they have this genre called dark comedy or whatever. They call it dark comedy, dark humor or whatever. And I can watch. I think this is a very interesting book. I'm not depressed sitting here with a gun to my head, sweating. I think it's extremely interesting, and I think it just displays the way white people think. And I think if you have two people, a white person and a non-white person, and you put them together, you're going to have a racist and a victim of racism. Like, have you seen the movie Man Friday, Gus?
I haven't, but I do want to make sure folks have time to share, so you can. Just saying, it's just that's the way the white people think. So then it's not like we think in the terms of we're going to fight white supremacy until it's done. It's just not really something that's natural to non-white people. So I think we have to focus on justice as opposed to just being the other type of supremacy. So I guess not to be pessimistic, but just to say that we are in a system of white supremacy, and white people do kind of have this way of thinking about war all the time. So, yeah, I guess that not to be pessimistic about the whole system, ending. I think that's inevitable, as it said in the last segment, like where eventually the proles are going to, like the birds, they're going to, they have the sustainability that the system doesn't, so I think it's inevitable. But I just think that right now we're in a system where people, so-called white people, they're in the minority, and they have this mindset that's just stuck in war. So, yeah. Any of the other callers on the line have anything they wanted to share? Any of the other folks on the line? Sorry, sorry about that. 9325 0218. Yes, you should be with us. 304.
Okay, this is 9325. Yeah, I was found it interesting when Winston was reading the book, and they got to the point where a child of an inner party member or parents, in theory, was not born into the inner party, and that an examination was taken at the age of 16. And, you know, I found that interesting because I lived a few years in Germany and found that that's the way that their society worked. In a way I heard, you know, I was told that by the age of 16, you were given a test or an examination, and depending on how you tested, that's what type of job you would be given. So if you just had a mechanical aptitude, then you would, you know, work in a mechanic. You would be a mechanic. You couldn't, like, work your way up, start out a mechanic and end up being an intellectual. You know, you had to test for that type of aptitude. I thought that was pretty interesting. You know, it seems like the book is going to accelerate a little bit now that Winston's been busted. But I thought it was interesting that, you know, it revealed part of the book to us. So the author was able to give us the structure, a little bit more insight on the structure of Oceania and how Big Brother was at the apex and then how the inner party worked. But I was hoping that it would reveal how you could become a member of the inner party. And unless I missed it, I wasn't able to find that out. I know that if you were excessively intelligent, you would end up being eliminated. The party didn't like that. If you were talented to a certain extent where you could be useful to the party, then you would be part of the outer party. And then the pros were the lower class. But how does one enter into the inner party? I didn't get a chance to, unless I missed it. I don't know whether they covered that or not.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
I was looking for that as well, caller. I don't think they covered that at all. But the point I wanted to make a comment. I wanted to say that just because something is accurate does not mean it's not bleak. Again, just because something is accurate does not mean that it isn't bleak. That was in regard to the response that the previous caller made during the last segment. And I thought what was very interesting in this segment was as soon as you know, he started to get really, really deep into the book, that's when he got busted. And to me, it signified that, you know, once you know a little too much about the inner workings of the totalitarian government, you know, they can pretty much get to you. You know, I think Winston said that you know, he would be busted real soon, and it could be 6 months from now or a year from now, but there was no telling. But he knew that he was going to get busted, so he knew that it was coming. That's pretty much all I had to say. Oh, I have a quick question. Was the owner of the shop
the one that rented Winston that room, was he the one that busted him, or because he said he had a different demeanor, like he stood up straighter, and I think I might have missed that. Was he the one that busted Winston?
This will become clearer as we continue with the book.
Oh, okay.
I would even say both of the points that you raised, how he got busted and when he got busted. Keep both of those in mind as we continue. Oh, and the caller from last week, when I think Julia, she pointed out that there were bugs in the picture. It turns out that there was a bug in the picture. I don't even know how long they've been using the history of that sense of the word bug, meaning a device that records or can capture audio, video, unbeknownst to people that are being recorded. I don't even know how long that's been in vogue, but it did turn out that the device was there. 304, the other folks, did y'all have anything?
I found it interesting that not only there was a pause because he was reading the book, and he was at this crucial point where they were about to explain like the why, like why is it all happening, and he stopped like at a very awkward point, and that was the point where everyone busted in. So it's like I feel like maybe it's how people talk about internalized this and that, internalized racism or whatever. But just the fact that like you say, the mind of white people is to practice racism, or that's what happens. And he stopped before he got to the point, and then he was distracted by Julia's body or whatever. But I found that interesting that he stopped himself from getting to the point.
What I thought was interesting also was when Winston went to see O'Brien, he answered a series of questions, and they were, revealing questions and kind of painted a picture like you would be a hardened revolutionary, you throw acid in a child's face, you would kill someone, and all that. He didn't seem like that type of person at that time. And then when he's busted, he's just standing there, and he's naked, and he feels, you get the impression that Winston was just, some wimped out guy. He's a wimped out wannabe, which makes you think that, when we're dealing with counter racism, how many people are really, dedicated to establishing justice or trying to replace white supremacy, or, with reality, with a real sense of purpose, and who's just maybe going to wimp out if something comes down, if you have to really go through something. How many can really stand the test? Being mistreated in this system is a test, but then practicing counter-racism should help us in our day-to-day lives. But, it just makes you think, would we really wimp out under a real test like this?
One thing I did want to toss in real quick. Other people have things they want to share. Winston, the intrusion by the Brotherhood, the enforcement officers, that doesn't stop him from reading the book. He stops initially to check to see if Julia's still awake, and then he notices that she's fallen asleep. and then he gets kind of lost into listening to the proll, the large woman singing outside. So there's a considerable amount of time before the intrusion, before the alarm sounds that they're being spied upon and that people are coming to take them away. He has enough time to keep going. He stopped, as I said, to check on Julia, large woman in the alley. Anyone have any other thoughts they want to share?
I want the comment that was made about something that he said. I guess he was saying that accuracy and bleakness, like basically he's saying accuracy and bleakness, like they don't really have to be separate, I guess. He was kind of saying something like that. And what I was thinking is that, like, when you say bleakness, like just, I feel like bleakness is like a perspective, and accuracy is more of a truth. You know, like I feel like bleakness is like the mind of racism. Like they can't really get out of that diminished view where they're always kind of watching themselves kind of wasting away, and they know that that's going to happen, and it's kind of like a nervous kind of eventuality that they have to keep on fighting against. So, no, I mean, I just think that is the mind of perhaps the mind of the system that we live in is bleakness itself. But I think it's eventually it's just not really sustainable kind of a perspective, thankfully.
I think you. Hello. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. No, I was just going to piggyback on the caller. I think he actually is touching on, something. The accuracy of it and the bleakness of the book is actually two separate things. And the bleakness kind of correlates to the system that we're under. I guess it's a perspective. If you're not continuously resisting, then it could look pretty hopeless or bleak. But I mean, if you look at it from Winston's point of view, as long as he was resisting and trying to make sense of the system, he felt a little bit more alive because he was putting two and two together. He understood. As long as he could say 2 and 2 was 4, he realized that he was sane. And you can look at that from when you start out on the counter-racism grind. At a certain point, you feel, because you're not getting much support, and then you have to question your sanity at a point because everyone else is considering you off your rocker. But you know that the system exists, and you can see it in your everyday existence. So it's like the end of that one chapter when it says sanity is not statistical. So the way I look at that is the vast majority of the people, the way that they think, that doesn't mean that that's sanity, the way the majority of people think. That's just their reality, and their reality may be distorted.
I wanted to make sure we had time. We have about 10 minutes left. If there are any other aspects to cover, I do think it's important, even though I want to move on, to make sure that we have time to hit anything else in the last few minutes. The term bleak might be important to ask people what they mean when they use that term. It might be important for clarity. but that's just one to think on. If anybody had other things they wanted to touch on in the last few minutes, one passage that I thought quite profound, we were talking about how does the racism, George Orwell, and perhaps him being a racist, that coming through in the book. I would turn to, this is PDF page 103. In principle, membership of these three groups is not hereditary. The child of inter-party parents is, in theory, not born into the party. Admission to either branch of the party is by examination taken at age of 16. Nor is there any racial discrimination or any marked domination of one province by another. Jews, Negroes, South Americans of pure Indian blood are to be found in the highest ranks of the party, and the administrators of any area are always drawn from the inhabitants of that area. In no part of Oceania do the inhabitants have the feeling that they are a colonial population ruled from a distant capital. That, and this is supposed to be in the book that Winston is reading, right there sounds like a very racist, very white thing to do. There's no racism here. Look at that. President Obama. You got all these black people that are in charge. Very racist. Like, for Orwell to have that, but even though it's in a book that he's writing about within his own novel, just the fact that he could put that there, knowing the nature of white people, that if white people are around, racism is always going to be the dominant priority. That is the war that's going on the planet. I thought that was a super racist moment. I'll mute my line. Were there any thoughts on the term black-white? Anyone have any thoughts around that?
Confusing, in a word. I guess it's just like how the gentleman, the previous caller said how before they were saying sanity is not statistical, and he was saying this as just so that he could not fall back into the party thinking, into the insanity of the party thinking after kind of coming into some type of semblance of sanity. Just like the other side of that, black-white, is just reminding yourself that the party is always right because they say it right. Flat Earth.
To say 204, just wanted to say that I that passage raised my eyebrows too. The one about the local leadership.
Very forced. Feels like the rhetorical ethic said that at the beginning. That black-white, I think that is huge. It's just like having chocolate at the center of a book. To have this as one of the integral features of how you are supposed to be in the inner party. And there's a passage that talks about the people that get into the inner party. They are the most indoctrinated with regards to having just an instinctive, I'll find it because I highlighted it. There were several passages in the section. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Isn't that where he said something that's about having a mystical belief? Like the inner party members, they had to have like a mystical kind of belief in the system.
I got it. On page 94, Brooklyn Caller is correct. Says it is precisely in the inner party that war hysteria and hatred of the enemy are strongest. I want to keep reading, but I just want you to kind of have in mind, I think we had talked about the Young Turks, even Quentin Tarantino. You have to prove that you are a white person, and you have to prove that you are superior to other white people in your ability to practice racism, white supremacy. Just keep that in mind as I continue reading. In his capacity as an administrator, it is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may often be aware that the entire war is spurious and is either not happening or is being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inner party member wavers for an instant in his mystical belief that the war is real and that it is bound to end victoriously with Oceania, the undisputed master of the entire world. That's how you get in the inner party. Mute my line.
It's like the passage from last week when, just before, I guess during Hate Week, when there was some politicrat, there was some politician that was speaking to the crowd, and there was, he's like all screaming and talking about wars and all this stuff, and the whole crowd is going crazy, and he's saying especially the little kids, they were the young school-age children were the most ferociously screaming about the war and everything, and giving their voicing their agreement, and then right in mid-speech he gets handed a piece of paper, and he's reading the paper. At the same time, he didn't skip a beat with his speech. He's still screaming about everything about the war, and he's looking at his paper, and then he takes the paper away without even skipping it. He's still talking, and then all of a sudden, all the words are changed inside of his speech. Like he does this all without skipping a beat. All the words in his speech suddenly change, and it's no longer a war against Oceania, against Eurasia. Now it's a war against East Asia or whatever. And then they're like, oh no, we have to change all the banners because Goldstein has foiled us, and he put up all these wrong banners, and we have to change everything. So just that kind of, you have to really, really drink a lot of Kool-Aid to be up there, especially if you're non-white, or I guess if you're non-white, particularly.
That is going to do it. There are 3 hours. Some of the folks, I know plantation responsibilities and what have you, but hands up earlier if you want to participate. It's supposed to be a dialogue. I definitely want people to share in. I wanted to read one last passage as we conclude things. This is on 107, PDF, page 107. Keep in mind the section that I read where Goldstein is saying, no racism. Party, we got black people, Negroes, South Americans of pure blood. Keep that in mind as I read this section where he says, even the names of the 4 ministries by which we are governed exhibit a sort of impudence in their deliberate reversal of the facts. The ministry of peace concerns itself with war. The ministry of truth with lies. The ministry of love with torture. And the ministry of plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary hypocrisy. They are deliberate exercises in doublethink, for it is only by reconciling contradictions that power can be retained indefinitely. In no other way could the ancient cycle be broken. If human equality is to be forever averted, if the high as we have called them are to keep their places permanently, then the prevailing mental condition must be controlled insanity. I think Dr. Welsing says no black person under the system of white supremacy qualifies for mental health. That is kind of quote-unquote bleak. Accurate, but also might be quote-unquote bleak. We will be back tomorrow, Saturday, compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Tarantino Django Unchained video is 30 seconds from being done. It has been laborsome, but I'm pleased with the almost end product. Should have that wrapped up. May even have it done before the compensatory call-in tomorrow evening. I will share the link. I am pleased. Check the blog post, racism-notes.blogspot.com. Lakers, white supremacy, white chocolate, and calling black people vanilla, all in the same post. Email, if you have thoughts, comments around 1984, can't share live, shoot me an email to read it on the program. We should have, I think, at least 2 more sections on this book before moving on to the next one. It's going to be good the last 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Invest if you think the program is constructive. We'll be back tomorrow evening. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I am so proud of Negroes who are proud of being Negroes. They are what God made them.